It was a dark and cold night. The wind battered the windows, and the rain poured in torrents over the roof of the small church. Inside, a young man named Andrés was alone, kneeling before the altar. There was nothing but the murmur of his breath and the distant echo of raindrops, which seemed to strike like drums in his soul. He had lost everything in life. His family had fallen into poverty, and the dreams he once held in his heart now felt empty, faded. Life had not been kind to him, despite all his efforts to get ahead. Every step he took seemed shrouded in shadows. Friends had abandoned him, and the few who remained could no longer offer the hope they once shared. "Why, Lord? Why have you left me in this abyss?" he whispered with a broken voice. The dim light of the candles flickered like a last flame of hope in his heart, but doubt overwhelmed him. It was then, in that moment of utter despair, that something happened. The door of the church slowly opened, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was not a human figure, but a warm and serene presence that seemed to illuminate the darkness surrounding Andrés. The young man lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with disbelief. A soft and peaceful voice spoke deep within his soul. "You are not alone, Andrés. You never were." Andrés slowly stood up, looking around, not fully understanding what had just happened. The figure in the doorway seemed to be surrounded by a warm light, but at the same time, it was impossible to tell whether it was real or a product of his imagination. The beating of his heart echoed in his ears as his mind tried to process the impossible thing that had just occurred. Who are you?" he asked with a trembling voice, anxiety taking over his body. The figure approached slowly, and as it did, Andrés began to notice something extraordinary. The peace emanating from that presence filled the air, as if everything it touched became calmer, more serene. "I am who you've been searching for, Andrés." The voice responded, deep and comforting, like a divine embrace. "I've been waiting for you here, in this place, to remind you of something very important. No matter how dark the path, there is always light at the end." Andrés, still confused, took a step back. "Light? What light? Everything is lost. I have no strength left." The figure smiled tenderly, its face full of understanding and compassion. "I know, my son, but it is precisely in those moments of darkness, when it seems the hardest, that the light of faith can shine the brightest. Your heart is tired, but there is something within you that you haven't discovered yet. Your faith." "Faith?" Andrés repeated, as if the word were strange to him, as if it had no meaning in his broken life. "Yes, faith. Faith is not just believing when everything is going well. True faith is believing when the world seems to be falling apart. It's trusting that something greater than your problems is guiding every step, even in the midst of the storm." Andrés remained silent, his eyes filled with tears that finally began to fall. "But how can I find that faith? I don't even know where to begin." "Today, dear child, is only the beginning. Faith starts when you let go of fear and surrender completely, when you trust that there is something greater than you that is holding you up." The figure came even closer, its light illuminating the church with a warmth Andrés had never felt before. It was a light that seemed to dispel his doubts, calm his anguish. For the first time in a long time, something inside him began to change. The weight on his shoulders started to lighten, as if something invisible were lifting him. "You are not alone. I am here and I will guide you." With those words, the figure extended its hand to Andrés, who didn't hesitate for a second to take it. In that moment, he felt an immense peace, something he had never experienced before, something that invited him to believe again. Andrés felt the warmth of the hand offered by the figure, as if a gentle and comforting energy flowed down his arm, reaching his heart. In that moment, the doubts that had tormented him for so long seemed to fade away, like fog dissipating at dawn. The light that surrounded him was something he couldn't fully comprehend, but he felt it deep within his being. A peace that surpassed all understanding. "What should I do now?" Andrés asked, his voice stronger, though still filled with uncertainty. "You must trust, but not just trust in what you see, but in what you don't see. Faith is walking in the darkness knowing that, even though you can't see the end of the path, there is a divine purpose guiding you." The figure replied, its voice full of wisdom and tenderness. Andrés looked around, seeing the empty pews and the altar where he used to pray hopelessly. Now, that same place felt different, more filled with an energy he had never experienced before. It was as if every corner of the church breathed faith and hope. "But how can I trust if everything around me is falling apart? If my life has no direction, my dreams are shattered, and I don't even know where to start rebuilding everything?" Andrés said, his heart still heavy with the worries of the real world. The figure smiled again, as if understanding the depth of his pain. "Faith is not the absence of doubts. Faith is the decision to move forward despite them. Sometimes you don't need to understand everything to start walking. You only need to take the first step." Andrés remained silent, reflecting on its words. The figure extended its other hand, and in a whisper, it said to him, "Today is the first day of your new life. Here and now you can choose to leave behind fear, sadness, anger. You can choose peace, you can choose hope." Andrés looked at his hands, the ones that had so many times touched the ground of despair. Now, with the light surrounding him, he felt that those same hands could, with God's help, rebuild what seemed irreparable. "I think I can try," he said with a sigh, a faint spark of hope igniting in his soul. "That's all it takes, Andrés. A small step toward faith. And when you trust, when you believe, you will see that the path will open before you, even if you can't see everything that lies ahead." The figure began to slowly fade, but its presence still surrounded Andrés. Before disappearing completely, it left him with one last word. "Don't forget, my son, that where there is faith, there will always be light." The figure disappeared with the same gentleness with which it had arrived, leaving behind an atmosphere of serenity in the church. The peace that filled Andrés's heart was not something fleeting. It was deep, lasting, like a promise that something had changed within him. However, the young man was still in the midst of the storm. Outside the church, life continued with its challenges, and Andrés knew that the true test of his faith had only just begun. That same night, as he left the temple, the cold rain continued to fall. But something inside him had changed. Although the world remained the same, his perspective had shifted. For the first time, he felt that he could face the problems that had tormented him for so long. As he walked through the wet streets, the shadows of the night no longer seemed as intimidating. Andrés recalled the words of the figure, "Where there is faith, there will always be light." The young man looked up at the sky, searching for something, perhaps a sign. Suddenly, the rain stopped, and a gentle breeze caressed his face. A flash of light pierced through the clouds, illuminating the path ahead. Andrés smiled, not fully understanding how or why, but feeling that it was the confirmation he needed. In the following days, Andrés's life did not immediately change. The difficulties were still there. Poverty, loneliness, the fear of the future. But something had transformed his soul. Suddenly, he was no longer alone in facing his problems. He felt that, even though he couldn't see the entire picture, there was a greater force holding him up, guiding him. He decided to do something he had never done before. Aware that his life couldn't improve overnight, he chose to take the first step. Helping others, even though he didn't have much to offer. One afternoon, while walking through the market, he saw an elderly man struggling to carry a heavy basket. Without a second thought, Andrés approached and offered his help. "Are you sure you can?" asked the old man, looking at Andrés with suspicion. "Yes," Andrés replied, with a smile that was almost a reflection of the light he still felt in his heart. "I don't mind what it costs. Sometimes, a little help is all we need." The old man looked at him for a moment, then smiled and allowed Andrés to take the basket. As they walked together, the man began to talk, sharing stories of his life and the constant struggle to survive. As they moved forward, Andrés felt a special connection with this man, as if, in that simple act of helping, his faith was growing stronger. That was just the beginning. Each time Andrés helped someone else, whether with a small gesture or a greater sacrifice, his heart felt lighter. He began to understand what the figure had told him, that faith is built step by step, with each act of kindness, with each small sacrifice. Despite the difficulties, Andrés felt that something was keeping him steady, something he couldn't see, but that filled him with an indescribable peace. As the days passed, Andrés began to notice something unexpected. Although his life was still filled with difficulties, he felt an inner strength pushing him to keep going. The small acts of kindness he had begun to perform not only helped others but were also healing him. His heart, once weighed down by despair, now beat with a new energy. However, the true test of his faith was yet to come. One afternoon, as he was returning from work, Andrés received devastating news. The small store where he worked was going to close due to the growing debt that the owners could not pay. The owner, a kind man but worn down by fatigue, approached Andrés with a worried expression. "I'm so sorry, Andrés," he said sadly, "but I can't go on. I have no more options. We'll have to close the store in a week." Andrés felt a blow to his chest. It wasn't just the loss of his job that worried him, but the fact that it meant he would no longer have the few resources that had allowed him to get by. The feeling of failure flooded him again. Though he had experienced small glimpses of faith in recent days, now he found himself at the same crossroads as before. With a heavy heart, he headed to the church, seeking comfort in the place where he had first found peace. He knelt before the altar as he had done so many times before, but this time something was different. He wasn't asking for answers. He wasn't pleading for a miracle. In that moment, Andrés understood that faith isn't about receiving what one wants, but about trusting even when one doesn't understand what is happening. "Lord, I know this is not the life I imagined. I don't understand what is happening, but I choose to trust. Help me not to lose faith, not to give up," he whispered with his eyes closed, as if those words could soothe his soul. Suddenly, a sense of calm enveloped him. It was as if something within him was saying, "You are not alone. I will always be with you." It was then that an elderly woman, known in the community for her devotion and kindness, entered the church. Upon seeing her, Andrés felt an inexplicable urge, as if something were pushing him to speak to her. "Mrs. Isabel," he said softly, "how can one keep going when everything seems to be in ruins?" The woman looked at him with a calm smile, as if she knew exactly how he was feeling. "My son, life is not easy. We all face trials, but faith is forged in the hardest moments. Don't lose hope, because in pain, restoration can also be born." Andrés looked at her, perplexed. "But how can there be restoration when everything seems lost?" "Because faith is never lost," the old woman replied with a serenity that left him speechless. "Faith is not about what you have or what you can see. It's about what you choose to believe, even when the world tells you otherwise. I assure you there is a purpose in all this, even if you don't see it now." Every challenge is an opportunity to grow closer to what God has for you. Andrés remained silent, feeling the wisdom of her words penetrate his soul. The woman gave him a blessing and said, "Don't let fear control you, my son. In the darkest moment, the light of God can shine the brightest. You just have to trust." Andrés left the church that afternoon with a heart a little lighter, although his mind was still filled with uncertainties. The words of the elderly woman, Isabel, echoed in his mind. In the darkest moment, the light of God can shine the brightest. You just have to trust. He didn't fully understand the meaning of those words, but something inside him began to change. He no longer saw adversity as an impossible obstacle, but as an opportunity to strengthen his faith. A few days later, the inevitable happened. The store closed. Andrés was left without a job, but something inside him no longer feared the future as much. He remembered what he had learned. Faith doesn't mean expecting everything to be solved immediately, but maintaining trust that, even when he couldn't see the path, God was guiding him. Instead of sinking into despair, Andrés decided to act. He used the little money he had to start something new, something he would have never dared to try before. Opening a small furniture repair shop, a skill he had learned from his father when he was a child. Although he didn't have many resources or experience in business, Andrés began working from home, repairing chairs, tables, and bookshelves for those who needed it. At first, it wasn't easy. The days passed slowly, and customers didn't come. But Andrés clung to faith, knowing that everything had a purpose, even if he couldn't see it right away. Whenever he felt his hope starting to fade, he remembered the light he had experienced in the church, that feeling that he wasn't alone. One afternoon, after a long day of work in his shop, Andrés was resting when he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found an elderly man who asked him to repair an old table that had belonged to his family for generations. The man seemed wary at first, but when Andrés humbly accepted the job, something in his attitude changed. "What made you open a shop in these times?" the man asked as he watched Andrés work. "I don't know," Andrés replied honestly, "but something inside me told me I should try, even when the circumstances aren't favorable." The man looked at him with a mix of surprise and admiration. Your faith in yourself, that's what's going to give you the strength to move forward. It may not be the perfect time, but there's never a perfect time to start. Sometimes, it's just about taking the first step. The man's words resonated in his heart. Somehow, that simple encounter gave him a new perspective. Andrés wasn't alone in his struggle, and although the path seemed uncertain, something inside him told him he was in the right place. As the weeks went by, more people came to his shop. It wasn't a big business yet, but the love and dedication he put into each task were invaluable. During one of those weeks, on a particularly quiet afternoon, Andrés looked up at the starry sky while taking a break. He remembered the darkness he had found himself in at the beginning, and how faith, though fragile at first, had guided him step by step towards something greater than himself. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, looking at the stars, "for not letting me give up." As the months went by, Andrés began to see a slight improvement in his situation. His workshop, though modest, was starting to be recognized in the community. People began to trust him, and soon he became known for his skill and dedication. However, despite this small success, Andrés still faced internal challenges. The fear of failure never completely disappeared, and although his faith had grown, he still found himself questioning if he was truly on the right path. One night, as he was preparing to sleep, Andrés received an unexpected call. It was the owner of the store where he had worked before. "Hello, Andrés. I know things haven't been easy, but I wanted to tell you that, due to a stroke of luck, we found a way to move forward. The business is about to reopen. I want to offer you your job back, if you're interested." Andrés stayed silent. The world seemed to stop as he processed the news. It was a tempting offer, especially because the financial security it offered was something he had always wanted. However, as he thought about the proposal, something in his heart began to resist. He remembered the words of the elderly Isabel. "Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to keep going despite it." "Thank you for thinking of me," Andrés finally replied, his voice firm. "But I've found something beyond security in this new phase. I've decided to continue with my workshop. I don't know where it will take me, but I'm learning to trust." The store owner tried to persuade him, but Andrés had already made his decision. He hung up the phone with a sense of peace, but also with a feeling of fear. Had he made the right choice? The fear of failure returned for a moment, but Andrés clung to the faith he had begun to build. The next day, the man who had asked him to repair the old table came back, and with him, he brought news that would change Andrés' life even more. "My friend is looking for someone to repair furniture in a bigger store. He spoke very highly of you and asked me to recommend you. Are you interested?" Andrés couldn't believe what he was hearing. The offer was incredible, and although he hadn't expected something so big, he understood that faith had borne fruit. He decided to accept the opportunity, but always remembering that his path did not depend on external circumstances, but on trust and commitment to his purpose. As the days went by, Andrés saw how his life began to transform. His workshop, though not his main source of income, became a space where he met people who inspired him. He learned to live without fear, to hand over his worries to God, and to trust that, even when he didn't always have answers, his faith was guiding him. Over time, Andrés not only saw improvements in his material life but also in his inner peace. Although the difficulties never completely disappeared, something had changed in the way he faced them. He no longer felt fear of uncertainty nor anguish about what the future might bring. He had learned to live with the certainty that God was guiding each of his steps. His workshop, though small, became a symbol of his perseverance and unwavering faith. Every time someone visited, it was no longer just for the quality of his work, but for the warmth that emanated from him. Andrés now understood that his purpose was not just to repair furniture, but to restore hearts. In every piece he restored, he saw a reflection of his own life, broken, but with the potential to be renewed. And he did it with love and dedication, as if each piece of furniture had a story to tell, and his mission was to restore the value and beauty it once had. One day, at the end of the day, Andrés stepped out of his workshop and looked at the starry sky, just as he had done many times before. But this time, he didn't feel uncertainty or doubt. He felt gratitude and awe for everything he had lived, for all the trials that had helped him grow. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered with a smile on his face. "Thank you for every step, for every lesson, for every moment of darkness that allowed me to find your light." In that moment, he felt a deep peace, as if God himself were smiling beside him, reminding him that faith is not always about getting what one desires, but about trusting that, in the end, everything has a purpose. And with that thought, Andrés understood that his life of faith was only the beginning of an even greater journey, one filled with opportunities to continue loving, serving, and growing. The true restoration had not only happened in his life, but in his heart. And now, with renewed faith, Andrés was ready to walk with confidence, knowing that where there is faith, there will always be light, even in the darkest of times.